Welcome back again, and so soon. We just put our last video up, and this one's actually only 3 days after putting that one up. So, pretty quick turnaround on this one. This is Savage Fabrication Insta Spool Performance. The reason I hold a phone in my hand at all times is I gotta answer a lot of questions. Now, all the little online apps and stuff for doing a lot of this math are here, as well as we got a fancy calculator. But I am Bradley Carter of Savage Fabrication Insta Spool Performance. We have our own chassis dyno, as well as we gather data from everybody else's chassis dynos. So that's how we learn a lot of this stuff. Today we're going to be going over compound turbochargers and why I can't say that I've found anything on the internet to date that has put every single part of what's going on into a paper. So we're going to go over that as rapidly as we can because we only got so much battery life left in our camera. So we got a pretty good idea of density ratio, pressure ratio, and all that stuff. So now we're just going to do it twice. So what this kind of looks like, the big thing is with compounds, the density ratios don't multiply by each other. And the pressure ratios don't multiply by each other. They're additive. But the big thing that we see that gets, well, actually, what we could do is we just go over like how most people look at it. Just real quick, we can say if we have 60 pounds of boost on our pressure gauge, so like post both turbochargers, we have 60 psi. PSI total, and say each turbocharger, say the first turbo is putting out 30, then we can see that the second stage is also adding 30 to that to net a total of 60 PSI gauge total. And when you look at this, first thing that comes to mind is that both turbos are running the same pressure ratio. Wrong. If you do your math using the turbos doing the same pressure ratio, you're going to wonder where your horsepower is at because you're going to go run on the dyno, and more than likely you're not going to see the math add up. You'll do all the math and you go run the dyno, and it might make the number you want, but you're going to, like, the smoke capacity might be wrong, or the EGTs might be higher than they should, stuff like that. So instead of both of these, both turbos are adding 30 psi, but the pressure ratios aren't the same. So if we were to look at this, we have 60 total, or 60 plus 14.7. So 74.7 absolute. So what we got, what we're going to do is go. We're going to just work on PSI, G. We would take 30 plus 14.7. We're going to go, say our first stage is making 30 plus 14.7 divide by 14.7. We have a 30 PR. Now, the next thing you can do is, well, if I got 60 total and this one's making 30, and the other one's doing 30, you would think that they're both doing a 30 PR. This is incorrect because what we failed to do was to take into account that the second stage's atmospheric pressure is not 14.7, it's actually 30 plus 14.7 is what the atmospheric is getting, and then it's turning it into 60 plus 14.7. So what we will do is we will go, we need to figure out our atmospheric pressure to the manifold turbo, so it's going to be the 30 plus 14.7. So now that our new atmospheric pressure is 44.7, and on the outlet of this turbocharger we have, so this is Atmo, and then 74.7 outlet. So what we're going to do here is we're going to take yeah, it'll be the 74.7 plus 44.7, and then divide that by 44.7, which is going to give our second stage is actually running a 2, 6, 7 pressure ratio. So we can see that our atmospheric stage at 30 psi is at a 3.0 pressure ratio, and our manifold turbocharger adding 30 psi to the total is at a 2.67 pressure ratio. So you got to calculate these two separate from each other, because what it's easy for us to just look at it and say interstage is at 30, total is at 60, then the actual pressure ratio of the other one would be the same as that one, which is incorrect, because when we would do it that way, we would come out with numbers that weren't matching up with dyno results. And then when we would do it this way, we'd actually get like much closer to what the dyno result was. This also helps make it to where you're not pulling so much compressor efficiency out of the manifold turbo, because we did some mathematic work for some of these setups that were running 100 pounds of boost, but we're only making 700 horsepower with plenty. They have plenty of fuel. Again, we can go back to the brake specific video where the brake specific also could have been fairly high, so that the tuning was off, which is was contributing. But at 100 pounds of boost, we probably should have seen more than. We would think at face value we should have more than 700 horsepower, but the issue was that, say we had a 50-50 or a 40-60 split, when you do it, the pressure ratios actually come out more like this, which actually still would show that it would net more horsepower than what, say, the truck made 700 on. So that's when we'll get into our next spot. So I think this all kind of makes sense. The big thing to take away from this is that you got to calculate the pressure ratios as individual turbochargers and then bring it back into the system. So the atmospheric turbo is working with 14.7 psi on its inlet, but our manifold turbo is working with 44.7 psi at its inlet. So it's atmospheric. Like if you were to look at a map, because a map is a tool that's based off of a really set of guidelines. So not all maps do this. Some of the more complicated or OEM maps do. Sorry. If you look at them, they'll have the temperature of the air that the map was made with, and they'll also have the absolute pressure that the turbo is fed at. They don't usually tend to correct a map to SAE. They'll actually in a test room or a test facility, they'll make it, and a lot of times it's in the temperatures in Rankine, not Fahrenheit, so you have to convert over just because it's a more scientific way to do it. But a lot of them are done, like OEM stuff will be 90 degrees Fahrenheit with at 28 inches of depression or at 25 inches of depression, which is an atmospheric pressure term. And then they'll flow them at that, and that builds the map. So you can see how the map totally changes if I say changed the inlet pressure from 20 inches of depression, or it's like 15 point something psi, to I think this is 44 psi. It's right around like 40 inches of depression. So you see there's a lot more pressure on the inlet, which is going to totally change what the map looks like, because the compressor dynamics and everything change. So when we do it this way, and now we can take, and you still don't add these together. This is just how you're going to go about calculating the next phase, which is the density ratio using each one of these. And then once you do the density ratio for this one, and the density ratio for this one, basically your big turbo and your small turbo, then you add those density ratios together and multiply that by the NaCFM. So next we can kind of show you how to do that. Okay, so we can see that the pressure ratios don't match up to each other, even though they're both technically like run the same boost pressure, both 30-30 and like 60. One of the other things, I guess, before we go into density ratio stuff that I forgot about was that in the scenario of compounds, the net gain and pressure ratio is higher if you increase the pressure of the atmospheric turbo versus increasing the pressure of the manifold turbo. So if it was 30-30 and then it went 40 manifold or 40 atmospheric, 20 manifold, the gains are higher than the opposite of that. Instead of going 20 atmospheric, 40 manifold, you'd gain less than if you did 40 atmospheric and 20 manifold. This is really hard to do just because our manifold charger is bigger than our atmospheric turbo is bigger than our manifold turbo. The only time you really can make that work is with really good sized chargers, like they're just sized right for application, and you're going to need external gates on the manifold charger to divert unused exhaust gas right into the atmospheric unit. That way we can keep the amount of gas flow total and mass to the manifold charger set to a limit, say 30 psi, and then we can feed all the other engine exhaust gas. All of that can go to the atmospheric unit instead, and we can now push the atmospheric unit to either maintain an equal number or go above the manifold charger. It's pretty rare to ever see that done, but if you did do it, it works. We did it where with one shop in California, they were having issues not getting the power that they wanted with a set of compounds, and he was running a lot of manifold pressure, but not a lot of pressure on the atmospheric. So I told him, we did the math, we looked at it, and I said, I think this is going to work. Like math-wise, it says it works. So I just gave it a shot. I think what's it hurt? We ran more E-gate on it and fed more gas to the Atmo, and both turbos actually went up in boost pressure just because the engine's making more power. But as far as the percentage goes, the atmospheric was able to get pushed up to a much higher pressure than it was before, and the truck went way faster. Instantly, we were making our times, or he was making his times down the track that he was looking for. It was based on the fuel quantity that he had. So the next thing we can look into with the compounds is density ratio and how to add up the density ratio with compound turbochargers. Let's just say so now that we know how to find out pressure ratios, the next thing you do is what we did before, but you do it again with the individual turbos like we did calculating density ratio with a single charger. So it's 3.0 PR times the compressor efficiency. And in this case with compounds with no interstage cooling, that's the number you're going to get. So if it's 3.0 times, like say 74%, then you're going to do your 3 times 0.7 times 0.7, which is 70, let's just say that's 70%. That's a 2, 1 DR. Now this is the part that I think often gets overlooked, is you would go and look at your compressor map for your manifold turbocharger and say at the 2.67 PR with the engine pulling this much, and we could look at it and be like, oh, I land on a 75% island. Here's the issue, is that's no longer true because we changed the temperature of the air and the pressure of the air. Mainly the main change is the pressure of the temperature. The pressure doesn't seem to do too much when it comes to the efficiency number, but the temperature does. So instead of feeding it, say the map that was generated was done with 90-degree air, and we're now feeding it 280-degree or 300-degree air, this 75% is no longer a real number. And this is where we got to work this on a chassis dyno until we come up with the right one. But often cases it'll drop down to around, if it was 70, it would be probably in the high 50s. low 60s. So we can just say instead of 70, we can say we're at 60%. Efficiency, so it would be a 2.67 times 0.6. That's us a 1.602 dr. Now you take these two and you add them together. 2.1. That gives us a total of 3.702 density ratio. So you'd be like looking at these numbers and you're like, ooh, those don't look too pretty. That's because basically there's no intercooling in here. So now at this point though, we're at a 3.702 dr at 60 pounds of boost. Now we're gonna go through the intercooler. The intercooler is gonna add, well, the other thing too is we basically superheat it, but your compressor's not gonna explode from superheating the air, and it's not really technically superheating, just getting a lot hotter. But a lot of people online like to tell you that you're gonna melt your compressor wheel down or you're gonna blow your compressor wheel up. Been doing compound turbos like this for probably over 20 years. I haven't, but they've been in the industry for over 20 years, and I haven't seen anybody melt a compressor wheel in the performance diesel industry. So the one thing though is because the air is really hot, so I went 300 degrees in and we're here probably looking at around 450 degrees or so. The deltas between your outside air going over the intercooler and the air going through the intercooler is a lot greater, and in this case the intercooler tends to have a higher efficiency. So instead of 45% efficiency, we might see 50 or 55% efficiency. So we can go with the 50%. You literally have to do this for the chassis dyno or track times to kind of get an idea, and then the best way obviously to do it is to put EGT probes interstage and post-stage, and then post-intercooler to see what's really going on. But you can get pretty close by doing the math and having a dynagraph. So we'll take a 3.07 times 1.5, 702 times 1.5. We now have 5 density ratio, which is pretty awesome. That's a high density ratio. So the motor thinks it's 5.5 times the size it is. So if you had a small set of chargers and you're able to get them, you're able to meet all these requirements and everything is good, you'd have a 5.53 density ratio, meaning the motor thinks it's 5.5 times the size that it normally is. And if you did that at 2,000 RPMs per se, or 2,300, that is a ton of torque. That is a lot of torque. Now, this is something that I got to a lot of times, and then would do the next math part where we would take this and just multiply it by the NACFM, and the horsepower never matched what the NACFM was. So I finally figured it out, because you would think that because the intercooler is really efficient, and you do the same math, that the air coming out of the intercooler is, say, 90 degrees, but it's not. So the intercooler is more efficient, but with the single charger, we were pumping in 300 degrees, and we would take it down to 100. In this case, we're putting in, say, 500 degree air, because we heated the air twice, the air's much hotter, and the intercooler is still extremely efficient, but the air coming out of the intercooler is now much hotter. So instead of getting it down to 100, we might be at 220. And that is key. When I did that, it'll make the horsepower add up without having to make the manifold turbochargers, compressor efficiency, just absolute garbage. Because what I was doing was pulling compressor efficiency out of the manifold charger, and I'd have to pull it down into like the high 30s to get it to make sense. And realistically, it's not what's happening. So instead, I increased the temperature of the air coming out of the intercooler, because we did heat it twice, and then did the math, and all of a sudden it worked. So, like, say we're moving 280 CFM NA, so we can take our 280 CFM NA, I'll just write it down, This is just theoretical. 280 CFM NA times 5.553 gives us 1,554 0.84 CFM, and normally you would take that and multiply it by your air weight, the 0.07. Oops. 1554.84 times 0.07. So if you did it times 0.07, say the air was 100 degrees, this would equate to if 100 degrees post intercooler at this much CFM, that would equate to 108.8 pounds minute air consumed. Here's the issue: it's not 100 degrees, it's 200 degrees. So instead of being 0.07, it's going to be, instead of 100 degrees, it's 200 degrees. At 200 degrees, air weighs 0.0602. At 200 degrees equals 0.0602 pounds per cube foot instead of 0.07. So if we did our new math of 1554.84, multiply that by 0.0602, that instead means we're only pulling in 93.60 pounds min, not 108.8. And if we did the 8 horsepower per pound of air, the difference is going to be, in this case, 200 degrees would equal a horsepower of 748.8 wheel horsepower. And at 100 degrees, if, say, we cooled the air after the intercooler with additional cooling, that would take us to 870.4 wheel horsepower. And so because of this temperature coming out of the intercooler, this actually explains a lot why a lot of compound systems aren't making the power that they should. This is one factor of it. The other factor is volumetric efficiency of the engine, so VE, when it comes to the drive pressure on between the manifold or the exhaust valve and the manifold charger. That also plays a role, but essentially pre-peak torque, the air charge is the main thing. And it'll help. It makes a lot of sense. So it's not that a compound turbo setup makes less horsepower than the atmospheric used as a single. It's that when you put the turbos into a compound configuration, nobody stops to take care of these extra things that now occur. And because of that, you get the stereotype that compound turbos make less horsepower than the atmospheric turbo used as a single would by itself. So that's where this comes from. If you look at like professional racing when it comes to sled pulling, tractor pulling, all that stuff, you'll notice that they do a lot of cooling if allowed. They'll do it interstage and after both stages to a very extreme degree to get all the power out of the setup. And they wouldn't be running the two atmospherics, because they're usually triples, as a single. Not a day, because they won't be able to net the 150 plus PSI that a lot of these systems run on that single charger without having turbo failures. So I think that about covers it. Might have to watch it a few times. So I think we're at the end of our video. I hope that this creates some questions. If we could probably put a few of the, we already have them up in the you actually just go check out the previous videos. All these air temperature things and all that stuff are in our earlier videos. If you want to just go check those out, it helps get us views and helps get more people to see this stuff, because it's really important. Like, this whole thing with compounds explains a lot and will allow you to better select the right compound chargers in the future, should you go this route. It makes a lot of sense about where the horse, like a lot of people tend to feel like they're missing horsepower with compounds. You're not missing horsepower because of turbos, you're missing horsepower because your system that was designed for a compressor outlet temperature of 200 degrees or 250 degrees maximum is now trying to cool down 500 to 600 degree air, and it is doing a fantastic job at it, so the efficiency is high, but the temperature still is at a high level. 500 degrees to 200 degrees is a efficient removal of heat, but it is still 200 degrees coming out of the thing, and we got to account for that temperature coming out. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because turbos are awesome, and diesel fuels is awesome, and horsepower is awesome. So more to come. The next one, probably go back to fuel on the next one. There's a lot of mysteries in fuel, unless there's more turbo stuff. The other thing on turbos, we can start talking about the exhaust side of things. I know we've been only talking about the compressor side, so we can start talking about the exhaust side, what the exhaust side is doing, or blade profiles, turbine blade profiles, compressor wheel blade profiles, whatever you guys want to do. So we'll be here making another one. So thank you for watching, and everybody have a good night.